First it was the parties, now allegations of bullying and blackmail. The latest salvo aimed squarely at Boris Johnson's government. Just as things seem to be calming, claims of threats against Tory rebels to try to force them into backing the Prime Minister.
The intimidation of a Member of Parliament is a serious matter. Moreover, the reports of which I'm aware would seem to constitute blackmail.
But the PM says he knows nothing of it.
I've seen no evidence, heard no evidence to support any of those allegations.
It all ratchets up the pressure on the PM as it emerges the civil servant investigating the party's scandal has, according to Robert, seen a key, potentially damning email. He'll be here to tell us more. Also tonight. On top of the anti-tank weaponry, now the UK sends special ops soldiers into Ukraine to help train its troops as fears grow of a Russian invasion. Scavenging for scraps for their families to make soup. The children of Afghanistan, the West deserted.
So what you can see here, this is what Rabia says she has salvaged from a local rubbish dump to feed her family. It's not very much. In fact, it's not nearly enough.
Against the grain, the gene-edited wheat, which could survive climate change. But is it a step into the unknown? And box office, two of Britain's biggest stars on their latest film, a lifetime of collaboration, and why it's not over yet.
I'm staying very, very quiet and hoping there's a new idea.
There'll always be a new idea for this film.
This is ITV News at 10 with Julie Etchingham.
Good evening. Blackmail is such an ugly word, as they say in corny TV crime dramas, but it was the word used today by a senior Conservative MP, adding to the pressure on the Prime Minister as he fights to hang on to his job. The MP, William Wragg, no fan of Mr Johnson's, it has to be said, accused Conservative Party whips and government ministers of intimidating backbenchers to make sure they support the Prime Minister and avoid a leadership challenge. Mr Wragg said fellow MPs had told him their constituencies wouldn't get the funding they were expecting and embarrassing stories about them could end up in the newspapers. Choosing his words carefully and not for the first time in this current political crisis, Mr Johnson insisted he had seen no evidence to back up Mr Wragg's remarks.
Karma. That is how Thursday began for Boris Johnson after one of his MPs defecting weirdly managed to improve his political health.
So what's this Trump road here?
Rebellious Tory stepped back from the brink. Boris Johnson went to this diagnostic centre in Taunton. But then, in Parliament, this.
In recent days, a number of members of Parliament have faced pressures and intimidation from members of the government because of their declared or assumed desire for a vote of confidence in the party leadership of the Prime Minister. The reports of which I'm aware would seem to constitute blackmail.
An extraordinary allegation. Are those tactics being used to try to stop MPs speaking out against you?
I've seen no evidence, heard no evidence to support any of those allegations, Anushka, and what I'm focused on is what we're doing to deal with the number one priority of the British people, which is coming through COVID.
I mean, I'm telling you that I'm hearing evidence from MPs. Will you look for that evidence?
Of course, but what we're focused on is what we can do to clear the COVID backlogs.
Your aides tell us that if there is a leadership contest, you'd fight it. Are they right?
Anushka, I admire your journalism, but I just got to tell you I'm focused on what I think is the number one issue.
Spot the Prime Minister's new tactic when asked about leadership. Changing the subject. But that won't make the questions go away, especially given the comments that followed from Bury South's new Labour MP.
I was threatened that I would not get to school for Radcliffe if I didn't vote one particular way. This is a town that's not had a high school for the best part of 10 years.
And it is not just Wakeford. 2 Conservative MPs have told me today that they recognise William Ragg's claims and have spoken directly to colleagues who have faced those threats. A Cabinet Minister rejected the claims.
It's literally nonsense. It doesn't happen. It's attention-seeking behaviour from an MP who's been a constant critic of the Prime Minister.
Back in Taunton, there was still plenty of anger.
And do you think he's the right leader for the country?
Absolutely not. Absolutely not.
He's just talking a load of rubbish, looking after himself and not us. That's the way I look at it.
But then also this.
On balance, I'd say he's done more good than harm.
On balance, Boris Johnson has bought himself more time with his MPs. But next week's report on Partygate could change everything.
And we'll be back to that very shortly. But Anushka, we should talk about these very seriously worded accusations made today. And we all know that politics is a tough business. What do you make of what's been said?
Well, look, the role of the parliamentary whip, those MPs whose job it is to try and persuade or threaten, perhaps, their colleagues to behave, to vote a certain way, is the stuff of legend. If you've ever watched House of Cards, you might think that there are quite extreme tactics used. And look, decades ago there were. I've heard stories of MPs being pinned against the wall. We've all heard of the little black book full of embarrassing stories that they can blackmail MPs with. But society has changed, and I have to say, parliamentary whipping has too. It's modernised. In the 12 years that I've worked here, I haven't heard of things as extreme as that. There is one threat that is often used, and that is that you won't get a job as a minister if you vote that way. But beyond that, whips tell me that they tend to use the carrot, maybe offer a little extra money to a constituency. Now, is this happening? If it is, it's quite small scale, but there are people who think that it is, and for them and for others, they do feel that it crosses a line.
OK, Anushka, thank you very much indeed for that. Well, let's talk to Robert now, and we'll return to the questions ahead of the Sue Gray investigation, which we are expecting early next week now. I mean, anything could happen, we know that. Some potentially damning material, though, that you know has emerged as part of this.
Well, that's right. As you recall, the Prime Minister's defence for going to this party on May the 20th, 2020, when we were in lockdown, was he, quotes, thought it was a work event and nobody told him that he was breaking the rules. Now, earlier this week, Dominic Cummings said that an email had been sent to the principal private secretary to the Prime Minister, a man called Martin Reynolds. He's sort of most important civil service working for the Prime Minister, and that email said, whatever you do, don't do this event. It's a party. It breaks the rules. Now, I disclosed earlier this week that this email was sent by a very senior official in Downing Street, somebody very influential when it comes to the behaviour of Boris Johnson. And I said that I thought Sue Gray would find the email. Now, what I've discovered today is she has found the email. And this is very serious for the Prime Minister because, you know, we now know that she has got evidence that his most important civil servant, the one who organised the party, the one who said bring your own booze, was told don't do it. In fact, I know more than that this civil servant then went to see the official that I've been talking to and said, please, why do I have to cancel it? And the official said, you know, you're breaking the rules. So the question for Sue Gray, which she will now be pondering, and my goodness, it's a hard task for her, is does she believe that this official, having been warned by somebody very important in Downing Street that this was a rule-breaking event, didn't say anything to the Prime Minister? Broadly, you know, if he didn't, he's failed in his job, and he's probably for the boot. And if he did, the Prime Minister's in very, very serious difficulties. OK,
Robert, thank you very much indeed for that. Now, for the avoidance of doubt, America's top diplomat has warned Russia that there would be a swift and severe response if it sends any forces into Ukraine. Why might there be any doubt? Well, Antony Blinken's boss, President Biden, appeared to let slip that a minor incursion by Russia wouldn't trigger a large-scale response. Tonight, British troops are in Ukraine to train local forces there. More on that in a moment. But first, how those remarks from President Biden might have weakened Secretary Blinken's hand as he prepares to meet Russia's foreign minister in Geneva tomorrow.
The Americans say that Russia's military build-up near Ukraine's border is now so extensive an invasion could happen at any time. New satellite imagery backs up that claim. Among the hundreds of vehicles in this one battle group, there are more than 70 tanks and self-propelled guns. With President Biden predicting that the Russians will move in, the US Secretary of State landed in Berlin today to stress the importance of Ukraine's sovereignty as a democratic nation.
That's why governments and citizens everywhere should care about what's happening in Ukraine. It may seem like a distant regional dispute or yet another example of Russian bullying, but at stake again are principles that have made the world safer and more stable for decades.
Mr. Blinken's words were meant to be reassuring, particularly given the seeds of doubt sown by his boss last night when he suggested that Western retaliation would be calibrated according to the scale of Russian aggression.
Russia will be held accountable if it invades, and it depends on what it does. It's one thing if it's a minor incursion and then we end up having a fight about what to do and not do, etc.
In case that sounded like a green light to Vladimir Putin, today Mr. Biden tried to take it back.
If any assembled Russian units move across the Ukrainian border, that is an invasion.
Joe Biden's assertion that the seriousness of any Russian invasion will depend on its scope and that punishments will vary accordingly has, of course, angered the Ukrainian leadership here in Kiev. But they've been careful not to be too vocal in their disapproval on the basis of not biting the American hand that feeds. In the city centre here, a memorial is being built to the 100 protesters killed during the Maidan Revolution of 2014, when pro-Western demonstrators ousted their Russian stooge of a president. That those martyred in the fight for democracy are being commemorated 8 years later tells you how much Ukrainians cherish the freedoms their compatriots died for. John Irvine, News at 10, Kiev.
Well, the British troops we mentioned are in place to start training Ukrainian soldiers on how to operate some new weaponry. GERAINT's here just to talk us through what we know about this deployment, GERAINT, and we should say that the weaponry is some that the UK has contributed.
Yeah, there are 30 soldiers that have gone to Ukraine. They're from the Special Operations Brigade, but we're not talking about the SAS. They're from the new Ranger Regiment, which for the moment is made up of regular units of the British Army. They're in Ukraine, as you say, to teach Ukrainian soldiers how to use weapons which were delivered to them earlier this week. And I think we can see some pictures now of them arriving by the Royal Air Force. They are anti-tank weapons. They're shoulder-launched missiles which can destroy a tank from a range of several hundred metres. So they are a crucial bit of kit, then, if you're trying to slow the progress of the kind of force that we saw built up there in Johnny's report. Two things, I think, to think about tonight, Julie. Firstly, these soldiers are not deployed in any combat role. They're going to be a long way from any front line, should it appear. But the UK now has, nonetheless, quite openly deployed its forces on the ground in a country which may very soon be invaded by a superpower, so not an insignificant development. And the other thing is, it's only the US and the UK, among the traditional Western allies, which are walking the walk in terms of providing practical support for the Ukrainians. France is providing really only diplomatic support, and the Germans are actively trying to stop arms and material getting to Ukraine. So in the face of what might be the most serious, significant military action on its borders it has seen since the Second World War, Europe is a long way from being united.
OK, extremely nervous times. GERAINT, thank you very much indeed for that. Thank you. Now, the roads and railways in England were busier today in rush hour as the advice to work from home was shelved. School pupils are breathing a little easier in lessons. Masks are now just to be used when moving about as Plan B comes to an end. In hospitals, though, they are still dealing with large numbers of coronavirus patients, and they don't want the lifting of restrictions to lead to thousands more.
By the looks of things this morning, the commuters were back. Less than 24 hours after the work-from-home guidance changed, people appeared to be flocking into the office. In schools, too, children were allowed to take off their masks. These, though, didn't feel comfortable just yet.
If wearing masks is the precautions we need to take in order to protect our community, then that's what we must do.
With our GCSEs coming up so quickly in just a few months,
It's really crucial that everyone's in school and in lessons, not only the students but the teachers also.
From next Thursday, though, even more restrictions will be lifted. Face coverings in all settings will be scrapped. Large venues will no longer require COVID passes, and the self-isolation rules are expected to be lifted by the 24th of March.
We've started to see in the data the case numbers are falling, hospitalisations are falling or stabilised in other parts of the country, infections are falling, and that allows us to take the measures that we announced yesterday.
But demand on hospitals is still high. More than 93% of beds are occupied in England. This community hospital in northwest London helps to free up beds by admitting patients who aren't quite ready to be discharged. But it can only do so much.
We're not there as a replacement for what's happening in A&E departments. We can relieve some of the pressures in terms of easing the bed numbers for a particular cohort of patients who would benefit from being here. But if people are sort of going into A&E in their droves, then obviously the pressures will build up there and people will have to wait.
Have they talked about you going home yet?
Not as yet.
James has seen the problems up close. The police had to take him to hospital after he broke his hip because the wait for an ambulance was so long. Then COVID set his rehabilitation back weeks.
I ended up getting COVID because somebody came in with it. And I had a couple of weeks here in isolation.
As restrictions finally do ease, hospitals are braced for another period of uncertainty. They hope demand won't increase, but nobody knows for sure. Emily Morgan, News at 10.
In the upheaval of war and in years of fighting between Taliban forces on the one hand and Afghan and Western forces on the other, nearly 6 million people have been forced from their homes. 3.5 million are still displaced within Afghanistan, with many living in camps. For our latest report from Afghanistan on life after the pullout of Western troops, we've been to one such camp where children are reduced to scavenging for food in rubbish dumps.
Empty plates, empty stomachs and expectant faces. Because this is the once-a-day moment, these children will receive a dish full of rice from an Afghan charity. Among them, Rabia, born into this world, sure-footed through thick mud and narrow alleys.
Which way? Which way?
To show us her home. A single room with 2 younger sisters and a brother who is just 10 days old.
What help do you have for your baby? You get nothing? No.
Most mornings you will find her daughter at work on one of the city's roadside rubbish dumps. She's searching for plastic bottles to sell to recyclers, and she takes home scraps that her family might eat.
So what you can see here, this is what Rabia says she has salvaged from a local rubbish dump to feed her family. It's not very much. In fact, it's not nearly enough.
And there are hundreds just like Rabia, whose parents were themselves children when they fled the war in faraway provinces. Afghanistan seems stuck in an endless cycle of destruction. There is just one place they can leave their troubles behind. But the teacher tells us he sees the mental and physical scars of poverty in every student.
Amid all this trouble, do you see hope for these children?
د افغانستان دولت او د ملت سره کومک وکړي نو موږ ډیر خاینده د خپل ماشومان لپاره نظر لرو او ان شاء الله موږ په دې مطمئن یو.
The idea that the Taliban and the world beyond can work together seems far-fetched. Over 4 decades, both have led to ruin. But Rabia's generation might yet face the worst crisis of all, in a country where only a child's laughter comes without cost. John Ray, News at 10, Kabul.
One of the many consequences of climate change is the damaging effect of extreme weather on crops around the world. One of the solutions, some scientists believe, is gene editing, for example, removing the part of the genetic code of a wheat plant that makes it susceptible to heat, allowing it to survive in drier conditions. As our new science editor Deborah Cohen reports, the government has given the go-ahead for further research now that after Brexit, the UK is no longer bound by stricter EU rules.
It's a crop that 2.5 billion people globally are dependent on. But there's something different about this wheat. It's been genetically edited to withstand increases in heat and adverse weather.
With climate change, as temperatures are increasing, then the yield of wheat is under threat. And so if we find a really key gene that may be impacted by temperature, it's possible that by gene editing we can make tiny tweaks to that gene which will make it more resistant to those temperature changes, so it will maintain the yield even under changing environmental conditions.
That's what they're doing in these labs. It's slow work, but it could produce fast results. Using modern genetic techniques, scientists are able to speed up changes which may take traditional breeders many years. Plants, including wheat, are made up of pages and pages of genetic code. Gene editing works by searching for a specific part of the code, for example, that makes it sensitive to high temperatures. It then cuts it from the sequence, changing the nature of the plant, in this case, making it more resistant to high temperatures.
The change that comes into effect today means that fields like this will soon be filled with trials of genome-edited crops. The technology in this area has advanced so much in recent years. The question is not whether it can be done, but what should be done.
When it comes to our food, some experts say checks and balances need to be in place.
We think field trials are really important in establishing the safety of this new technology. But we need to be thinking about more than just safety. But there's also the potential for it to intensify already unsustainable farming practices, to increase yields and profits without actually benefiting consumers and the environment in the way that is promised for this technology.
This could just be the start. There are hopes that these techniques could be used to make the food we eat more nutritious. But ministers say it's important that both scientists and those who want to know where their food has come from are on board.
We're very aware that, this whole area can feel worrying to people. So what we're taking is the first small proportionate step to allow our scientists to really, really look at this technology and see where gene editing can benefit people.
With scientists in England now trying to speed up nature, there's hope they could answer some of our biggest shared challenges. The question is, which ones we prioritise? Deborah Cohen, News at 10.
Now, it was 75 years ago that the diary of Anne Frank was published. Her account of living in secret and in fear in Nazi-occupied Amsterdam has stood as a reminder of the darkest dangers of anti-Semitism. At a special event to mark the anniversary, Camilla, the Duchess of Cornwall, said to prevent any prejudice, we must not be bystanders. It is a maxim heeded today by the Yorkshire cricketer at the centre of a racism storm.
The story of Anne Frank has been well told. 36 million copies of her famous diaries have been published since 1947. But as Hitler stepped up attacks on Jews across Europe, Anne Frank didn't just dream of a world free from anti-Semitism. She wrote in her attic about a world free from all forms of racism and intolerance. Which explains in part the presence today of cricketer Azeem Rafiq, as he, alongside the Duchess of Cornwall, marked 75 years since Anne Frank's diary was first published. Rafiq spoke last year of the racist abuse he suffered when he played at Yorkshire, but he later had to apologise when his own anti-Semitic language came to light in Facebook posts from a decade earlier. And he told us today how he's been embraced by the Jewish community since his apology.
You've been on your own journey as far as intolerance and racism is concerned.
Yeah, I think there's a lesson there that if you have messed up, if you have got things wrong, you own up, you own it properly, and the people that you've hurt will open their arms and shoulders and bring you in.
So as the Jewish community today remembered Anne Frank, Rafik shared a stage with her stepsister, who is a Holocaust survivor, and listened as Camilla said no one should be bystanders to prejudice.
Let us therefore learn from those who bore witness to the horrors of the Holocaust and all subsequent genocides, and commit ourselves to keeping their stories alive, so each generation will be ready to tackle hatred in any of its terrible forms.
After her hiding place was revealed, Anne Frank was sent to Auschwitz-Birkenau with her family. She did not survive, but her stepsister did, and says that diary is still teaching tolerance so long after it was written.
She hoped the world would listen to what she was writing as a child, but of course the effect it really had on her, on the world now, is unbelievable, unbelievable.
Rafik says he will now travel to Auschwitz. He has been on the receiving end of intolerance, but he says even he has much to learn. Chris Ship, News at 10, Central London.
The two big British hopes in the Australian Open are packing their bags and heading home. Emma Raducanu's third Grand Slam tournament after Wimbledon and that US Open has ended in the second round. She battled both her opponent Danka Kovinic and a painful blister on her right hand. Resorting to soft forehand slices to reduce the impact, she went out, sadly, in 3 sets. So too did Sir Andy Murray, a former Australian Open champion. He lost to Taro Daniel, who is ranked 120th in the world. Daniel is the lowest ranked player ever to beat Sir Andy in a Grand Slam. Finally, it is a story that the actor Sir Kenneth Branagh has waited all his life to tell. His story, that of a little boy growing up in Belfast during the violence of Northern Ireland's Troubles. What's more, he got one of his best friends, Dame Judi Dench, to help tell it. It sounds a bit dark, well, parts of it are, but when they talked to us today, Sir Kenneth was keen to explain this family saga reflected every bit of life and positivity that was possible in those darkest of times.
When you're ready.
Are we ready?
Yep. Big clap.
When Dame Judi Dench says action, it's action.
It's not how the story ends, but rather the place where it begins.
In her latest collaboration with Sir Kenneth Branagh, she helps him tell a story based on his early years in Belfast, living during the Troubles. She plays the grandmother of Buddy, who, like Branagh, witnessed the violence, leaving for England with his family in 1969.
This is the time to make a new start.
He wrote and directed Belfast and was determined Dame Judi, who's half Irish, had to be in the film.
It's based and inspired by my own grandmother, who's an amazing person. When I asked Judi to do anything, I've been very lucky to work with her many times. As a director, I know that she likes to be positively frightened by what's ahead of her. She doesn't like anything safe. She likes a challenge, don't you?
I do like to be frightened about it.
And in this case, possibly the Belfast accent was what put the wind up your
and continues to do so.
And women can smash your face in two, mister.
What persuaded you to do the role?
Ken came down and read it to me. And it was a very remarkable morning, that. And I sat and he read it and told me the story. And I expect I would have fought anyone else who was going to play the role.
The film has comedy and music and is told through the eyes of Buddy. Kenneth Branagh was 9 when he left Belfast, but he wanted to tell a story that reflected the joy of his childhood too.
It's one of the things that's amazing about that period in the history of Belfast is the way in which people, as part of the coping mechanism, threw themselves at humour, threw themselves at dance, threw themselves at ad hoc parties, threw themselves at songs, found every bit of life and positivity that was possible in the darkest of times.
My dear boy. On stage and screen since the 80s, Dame Judi and Sir Ken have been something of a double act. He's directed her and she's directed him. They've played mother and son, husband and wife. Now in Belfast, she's granny.
when Ken said, I want you to play my grandmother in this, I said, I'm not nearly old enough to play your grandmother. Yes, but then, of course, you know, it was back in the 70s and I put my wig on and it was very, very dark and I realised that I was actually too old for the part, but there we are.
Are you going to work again together?
Never. I have to wait to be asked. I'm staying very, very quiet and hoping there's a new idea.
There'll always be a new idea for this one.
And action! Even if there isn't, their shared back catalogue is impressive enough. Nina Nana, News at 10.
All the stars speak to Nina Nana. That is where News at 10 ends for tonight. From all of us here, good night. We'll see you tomorrow.